The small bedroom was cloaked in shadows, illuminated only by the flickering glow of a computer screen. Daniel sat hunched over his desk, his face bathed in the bluish light as his fingers danced across the keyboard. The sound of explosions and digital footsteps filled the air, the game pulling him deeper into its virtual world. Outside his window, the world had long gone to sleep, but for Daniel, the night was just beginning. Piles of textbooks lay forgotten on his bed, corners curling and pages untouched. His school uniform was crumpled on the chair in the corner, a stark contrast to the neatly arranged gaming peripherals on his desk. It was a scene of quiet rebellion, a 16-year-old choosing the thrill of battles and quests over equations and essays. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, but Daniel didn't notice. He was lost in the game, his avatar sprinting through a dense jungle, evading enemies and collecting loot. The outside world felt distant, unimportant, a place where problems like failing grades and lonely lunches at school could be ignored. Here, in this digital universe, Daniel was a hero. A knock at the door startled him, but it was faint and hesitant. His mother, as usual, didn't wait for an answer. "It's late." Her voice came through, muffled and weary. "You should go to bed." "I'll sleep soon," Daniel replied without turning around, his tone curt. The footsteps receded, and the house fell silent again. Daniel exhaled in relief. He knew she wouldn't press him. She never did. His mother was always busy, working long hours at the diner to make ends meet. She barely had the energy to argue, let alone enforce any rules. His father had left years ago, and Daniel couldn't remember the last time they'd had a real conversation as a family. He leaned back in his chair, letting his gaze drift to the faint outlines of the room around him. The posters on the wall, dragons, spaceships, and knights, seemed to mock him now, as if reminding him that he was stuck chasing fantasies. For a fleeting moment, guilt bubbled up. His grades had been abysmal for months, and his teachers had started calling him out in front of the class. He clenched his fists, brushing the thought away. None of that mattered here. The screen flashed a "game over" message, and Daniel groaned. His avatar slumped to the ground, defeated. Frustrated, he clicked "Restart," his determination to win renewed. The virtual world was the only place where he felt control, where failure could be undone with the press of a button. The clock ticked on, unnoticed, as Daniel dove back into the game. The faint light of dawn crept into the room, but it couldn't pierce the walls he had built around himself. For now, this was his refuge, his escape from a life that felt too heavy to bear. The morning sunlight streamed through the classroom windows, but Daniel sat slouched in his chair, staring blankly at the blackboard. The teacher's voice droned on about algebraic equations, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying last night's gaming session. A yawn escaped him as he scribbled random doodles in his notebook. "Daniel!" The teacher's voice cut through his daydream, sharp and unforgiving. "Perhaps you can solve this equation for us?" Heads turned toward him, a sea of curious faces. Daniel blinked, panicking as he glanced at the board. His notebook was empty of anything useful. A wave of heat rushed to his face. I don't know," he mumbled. The teacher sighed, disappointment etched into her features. "This is the third time this week. See me after class." The snickers of his classmates stung more than the reprimand. As the lesson continued, Daniel sank lower in his seat, feeling like an outsider. He'd once been a top student, admired for his quick thinking and clever insights. But that was before the games consumed him, before his grades plummeted and the invitations to study groups stopped coming. At lunch, Daniel sat alone at a corner table, poking at his food. His tray was piled high with untouched items, the cafeteria's effort to serve a balanced meal. Around him, conversations and laughter swirled like an invisible barrier. He spotted a group of his former friends, huddled together and sharing jokes. One of them glanced his way and whispered something, prompting the others to chuckle. Daniel shoved his tray aside, appetite gone. That evening, he sat in his room, staring at his report card. The red marks felt like a judgment, a reminder of how far he'd fallen. His mother's tired voice echoed in his head from their argument last week. You're wasting your potential, Daniel. I don't know what to do with you anymore. He glanced at his computer, its glow beckoning him. A part of him knew he was running from reality, but the escape was too tempting. The following week, Daniel found himself outside the school computer lab. His teacher, Mrs. Harper, had insisted he attend an extra session with Mr. Carter, the new programming teacher. Give it a chance, Daniel, she'd said with a small smile. You might surprise yourself. Daniel wasn't so sure. He shuffled into the lab, greeted by rows of humming computers and a faint smell of coffee. Mr. Carter stood at the front of the room, wearing a plaid shirt and a warm smile that didn't seem forced. He gestured for Daniel to take a seat. Daniel, right? I've heard you're quite the strategist in games. Daniel blinked, surprised. Yeah, I guess. Mr. Carter leaned against the desk, his tone casual. Did you know a lot of those games are built with programming? It's like solving puzzles but with a bit of creativity thrown in. Daniel raised an eyebrow. He'd never thought about the mechanics behind his favorite games. I never really considered that. Mr. Carter nodded. How about we try something? I'll show you how to write a simple program. Ever heard of Python? For the next hour, Mr. Carter walked Daniel through the basics of coding. The lines of text felt strange at first, but as Daniel typed out commands and saw the results appear on the screen, something clicked. It wasn't just dry theory. It was like crafting a world from scratch. By the end of the session, Daniel had created a basic program that asked for a player's name and displayed a personalized welcome message. It wasn't much, but it was his. This is kind of cool, Daniel admitted, a hint of excitement creeping into his voice. Mr. Carter grinned. Stick with it, and you'll be building games instead of just playing them. There's a free programming workshop next week. I think you'd enjoy it. As Daniel left the lab, a faint spark of curiosity replaced the usual haze of apathy. For the first time in months, he wondered if there was more to life than the endless cycle of gaming. Daniel's fingers hovered uncertainly over the keyboard as he sat in front of his computer, staring at the blinking cursor on the blank screen. It had been 3 days since his session with Mr. Carter, and he was back in his room, trying to piece together the basic Python code Mr. Carter had taught him. The temptation to load up his game was powerful, like a siren call that promised an instant escape from his frustration. His fingers itched to click the familiar icons, to return to the world where success was easy to achieve and failure could be undone. But something small but persistent, made him hesitate. It was a new feeling. The rush of winning a game no longer seemed as fulfilling as it once had. There was something more satisfying about solving problems, about the quiet thrill of seeing the lines of code actually work. With a sigh, Daniel minimized the game window, closing his eyes for a moment. Just 5 minutes, he muttered. He turned back to the screen, the lines of code blinking back at him like a challenge. Slowly he typed. Then again. And again. It took longer than he expected, but when the program finally ran, when the message, "Hello, Daniel," popped up on the screen, he grinned. He'd done it. His heart raced, not from the excitement of leveling up in a game, but from the feeling of accomplishment. It was real. It was his own. The next day, Daniel walked into school feeling something different. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was a sense of purpose behind his steps. The weight of the report card that had haunted him for weeks didn't feel as heavy. Maybe it was because he'd found something new, something that made him excited to wake up in the morning. During lunch, he finally spoke to one of his old friends, Alex, who had been quiet around him lately. "Hey, you want to join the computer club after school? It's kinda interesting," Daniel said, half unsure of how his friend would respond. Alex raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Wait, you? Computer club?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah. I've been trying something different. Programming." Alex chuckled. "I never thought I'd hear you say that. All right, I'm in." By the end of the week, Daniel had joined the computer club. Mr. Carter was right. The free programming workshop was just around the corner. It wasn't much at first, just a handful of kids typing away, learning simple codes. But as he sat there, surrounded by new faces and teachers who seemed genuinely invested in his success, Daniel realized he had made the right choice. Each day after school, he spent more time in the computer lab, learning and experimenting with code. And though the temptation to return to his old gaming habits was still there, he could feel the change deep within him, a spark that kept him coming back for more. The months passed in a blur of code, formulas, and endless tutorials. Daniel's grades started to improve, not drastically at first, but enough to catch the attention of his teachers. The once dreaded math problems and science equations now felt more like challenges to solve, not obstacles to avoid. His focus had shifted, and each passing day brought him closer to the person he wanted to be. It wasn't just about the grades. It was about what he was learning, about how he could use programming to create something of his own. His late-night gaming sessions were fewer, replaced by quiet moments of coding and solving programming puzzles. When he did game, it wasn't to escape his problems anymore. It was to appreciate the world that others had built, to see the intricate lines of code woven together to make the magic happen. Daniel's new passion for programming became contagious. He joined online forums, participated in coding challenges, and began designing his first game, a small, simple platformer game that he'd spent weeks perfecting. Each bug he fixed felt like a small victory, a tangible reminder that his hard work was paying off. But even with his newfound focus, there were struggles. Balancing his studies with coding wasn't always easy. He'd sometimes slip into old habits, staying up late working on his game and neglecting his homework. There were days when his mind wandered back to the familiar glow of his gaming screen. One evening, Daniel sat at his desk, exhausted. His eyes were heavy, and the room was silent except for the faint hum of his computer. He had a big programming competition coming up, and he was still working on refining his code. But the temptation to give up, just for tonight, just to take a break, was overwhelming. He glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. His hand hovered over the mouse, about to open the game. But then he remembered something Mr. Carter had said. The most important part of programming is persistence. The game you're building, the challenge you're solving, none of it happens without focus. You've got this, Daniel. You just have to believe it. Daniel let out a deep breath, pushed his mouse aside, and returned to his game. It wasn't just about completing the project anymore. It was about proving to himself that he could do it. That he could stay committed, even when it was hard. The next day, Daniel was ready. The competition was fierce, but as he worked through the challenges, something clicked. The pressure, the nerves, none of it bothered him. He was doing something he loved. The lines of code flowed with ease, and by the time the competition ended, Daniel knew he'd given his best effort. When the results were announced, Daniel didn't win first place. But he won something even more valuable: respect, from himself and from his peers. The feeling of accomplishment, of knowing he had come this far, was better than any victory in a video game. And in that moment, Daniel knew he was on the right path. It was the day of the national programming competition, and Daniel's nerves buzzed through his veins like static. His fingers were slightly shaky as he adjusted his glasses and settled into his seat in the large, sterile auditorium. The room was filled with competitors from across the country, all hunched over their laptops, their eyes locked on the screens. The air felt thick with tension. Daniel glanced at his computer, his project for the competition. It was a game he'd spent the last few months perfecting. He'd created the concept, coded the logic, and designed the mechanics. Now all that was left was to present it, and hope it ran smoothly. But the pressure gnawed at him. His heart raced, his mind began to spiral into doubt. What if the game crashed? What if his code had a fatal error that he hadn't caught? The questions flooded in, relentless and heavy. He reached for his water bottle, but as he picked it up, his hand trembled. The old temptations of gaming, of avoiding the stress, crept into his mind. What if he could just lose himself in the comforting, mindless rush of a game for a few hours? He glanced at the clock. He had hours before his submission. A fleeting thought passed through his head. He could take a break, just one break, and then come back refreshed. His fingers hovered over his keyboard, about to open a familiar game he'd downloaded just in case. But before he could click, a voice echoed in his mind, Mr. Carter's voice. The most important part of programming is persistence. Daniel's chest tightened as he remembered all the late nights, the countless hours of coding and troubleshooting. He thought about how far he'd come, how he'd risen from a boy who had nothing but a game controller in his hand to a young man on the verge of changing his life. With a deep breath, Daniel slammed his hands back down onto the keyboard. He closed the window for the game and went back to work. He rewrote the last few lines of code with focus and precision, feeling the pressure lift as his fingers flew over the keys. Minutes later, the clock ticked down. Time was running out. The final submission button hovered on the screen, a simple click away. Daniel clicked it, his heart pounding in his chest. He leaned back in his chair, his body tense, waiting for the results. When the screen flashed, submission successful, Daniel closed his eyes. There was no turning back now. Later, as the competition wrapped up, Daniel wandered through the crowd, trying to shake off the anxiety. He knew the results would be posted soon, but a part of him felt surprisingly calm. Whether he won or not, he had already accomplished something bigger than a prize. And then, the announcement came. First place goes to Daniel Torres from Valley High School. The room erupted in applause, and for a moment, everything around him felt surreal. His stomach flipped as he stood up, a mix of shock and joy surging through him. He made his way to the stage, the weight of the trophy in his hand almost symbolic of the weight he had shed, the weight of self-doubt, of being lost in games. As he accepted the award, the crowd cheering around him, Daniel realized that he had not only won a competition. He had won back his future. Years later, Daniel sat in a sleek office, the windows of the tech company overlooking a sprawling cityscape. His fingers moved quickly over his keyboard, writing lines of code with ease. His latest project, a game designed to teach coding to children, was nearing completion. He'd poured his heart into this one, remembering the days when he had been just like the kids he now sought to inspire. The world had changed for him in ways he had never expected. Gone were the days of late-night gaming binges and missed opportunities. He had graduated from college with honors, thanks to the programming skills that had transformed his life. The company he worked for had recognized his talent, offering him a position that not only allowed him to build games but also to give back to the community that had once supported him. But it wasn't just the job that made him feel fulfilled. Daniel had become a mentor, guiding the next generation of students, just as Mr. Carter had once guided him. He now volunteered at the very same free programming workshops that had changed his life, teaching kids how to build games and helping them unlock their own potential. One afternoon, as he was leaving the office, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Mr. Carter. "Congratulations on your latest project, Daniel. I saw the launch. It's amazing to see how far you've come. Don't forget, I'm always proud of you." Daniel smiled and leaned back in his chair. He thought back to the day Mr. Carter had first introduced him to the world of programming. Back then, he had never imagined he would be here, in a high-rise office, designing games that could change the lives of others. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything he had overcome. The struggles, the isolation, the failures, none of them seemed important now. What mattered was how far he had come. He was no longer lost in the virtual worlds of games. He was creating his own world, one that was real and full of possibility. As he walked out of the office building, Daniel paused for a moment, looking up at the sky. He thought of his younger self, sitting in a dark room, lost in games, unsure of his future. And now he knew. Education had changed his life. Hard work and persistence had turned his dreams into reality. "Thank you," Daniel whispered to the sky. He didn't need to say it to anyone in particular. It was for everyone who had helped him along the way, and for the boy who had believed that a game could be more than just a way to pass time. And now, he was the one helping others find that same belief.